This next one, the sixth one, is actually from India. So this should be interesting. It's a little bit of a combo breaker here, but it's similar. It has heterosexuals as most privileged, and then lesbian, gay slash bi in between. And bizarrely, it has asexuals as the most oppressed, least privileged category. Again, is it saying they're least privileged because they're the victim of their own biology, or because society somehow persecutes asexuals the most somehow? I don't know what it is. This has cis man, then cis woman, then trans. So I guess fairly consistent with a lot of them. Even in an Indian context, it doesn't use the word white, obviously, but it says fair skinned people are more privileged than dark skinned people. Now, for the age category, because it's India, it's a bit different. It has like esteemed elders as like in the most privileged category, and then youth. And then after that is middle-aged and young adult. And then finally, in the least privileged category, vulnerable elders and children. So this one is totally different in terms of how it categorizes the different age groups by privilege. So I guess maybe is it because India has a different culture toward age? I don't know. But this is the only one where middle-aged people are not considered the most privileged. So that's interesting. It has urban people as more privileged than rural. They don't have a suburban category. I mean, I don't know. Suburbia, I don't think really is a thing in India in the same way as it is in Western countries. I don't think so. For relationships, yes, it has married as the most privileged, and then single slash divorced slash widowed as least, and then people in relationships who are not married is in between. So yes, incels rise up. They're still acknowledging that like single and divorced people are less privileged. Although again, I don't know the context, but yeah. Now for religion, it has Hindus as most privileged, Jews and Sikhs next category, then Muslims and Christians, and then at the latter, the last category, indigenous religions. So I find that interesting that Jews are more privileged than Muslims and Christians according to this ranking, and of course Hindus are the most privileged of all because it's India. So yeah, there does seem to be some disagreement on religion, but I think it depends on what country this thing is for. Like the ones for Western countries pretty consistently have Christians as the most privileged, but because this one's India, it has Hindus as the most privileged. So that's interesting. I am sure there's a lot of Westerners who would white splain to them and be like, no, Christians are the most privileged even in India because Christianity is the dominant global religion. Blah 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 blah. It's such bullshit. It's complete fucking bullshit. I mean, I would agree. Hindus are the most privileged in India. Like in India, it is a privilege to be a Hindu. You are privileged over other religions. That is absolutely true. And again, this is one thing a lot of white leftists don't acknowledge is that other cultures have their own hierarchies that are different from the hierarchies we have here. And again, the hierarchies we have here don't always correspond to what leftists say in the first place, but regardless, my point is non-Western countries do have different hierarchies, so that is accurate. Okay, so privilege wheel number 7. This has slim above average above obese for body type, property owner above renter, white above different shades above dark, hetero above gay man above lesbian slash bisexual. So this is pretty similar to a lot of the others. Nothing really that unique on this one. Number 8 has, slim above average above large, property owner above renter, white above different shades above dark, hetero above gay man above lesbian slash bi. So this is, again, very similar. The next one has, cis man above woman, above cis woman, above trans, hetero above gay man, above lesbian slash bi, whites above different shades above dark, slim above average above large, owns property above renting. Okay, so these are all very similar, these ones. So on to number 10. Settler above indigenous, European above non-European, Western above non-Western, white above racialized, Christian above non-Christian, straight above LGBT, middle-aged above older adults, above youth, which is interesting because sometimes they put They often put elderly in the least privileged category, but this one puts youth as the least privileged category. I personally think age privilege is too hard to rank because it's like each age has its own pluses and minuses. I mean, and again, it goes back to the fundamental question: is privilege determined by objectively whether you're just have in a situation that's good or bad, or by how only by how well other people treat you? Because it's like, say for instance, elderly people are treated better by society in some ways than younger people, but it also sucks to be old. Like, it objectively just sucks to be elderly because you're weak, you're frail, and you have the lingering prospect of dying hanging over your head. So it's like, how do you rank privilege in that regard? It's kind of confusing. But yeah. Anyway, this one, it has, again, urban above rural, which, as I've pointed out, again, like, I mean, they're kind of shitting on their own base by saying this. Not only that, but they're flat out saying like a predominantly white demographic is less privileged than a demographic that's much more diverse. Using their definition of the word diversity. And then they have cis man above cis woman, which is above trans / non-binary. So yeah, pretty consistent with most of them. And then citizen above immigrant. Okay, so for the 11th one, they have... This one's very interesting. For the first time, they have political parties. They have Democrat / Republican as the most privileged, then third party, and then politically apathetic, uninterested people as the least privileged. So I find that interesting. They're saying that if you're part of like the Nazi party, you're less privileged than if you're Democrat / Republican. Interesting. So like, or if you're part of like the Northwest Front or whatever. If you're part of the National Justice Party or the Traditionalist Workers Party or any other far right party, you are less privileged than a Democrat or Republican. And then if you're politically apathetic, you're the least privileged of all. So this one's interesting. It's the only one that actually has this as a category, and I'm very surprised they have Republicans and Democrats as the same and not Republicans as the most privileged. That's interesting. So this one is interesting for marriage categories. They have married, then never married, then at the least privileged, divorced, separated, and polygamous. So they have incels as more privileged than divorced people. Now that's an interesting question. Who actually has it worse? Incel, like, well, I mean, virgins or divorced men? It's an interesting question. It's hard to say. Because both have it pretty fucking bad. Having polygamous as being the most oppressed, I think, is just bullshit. But yeah, they're put in the most oppressed category. Like, how do they define polygamy? Do they mean like actual like institutionalized polygamy, or do they mean like women who just fuck a lot of guys? Like, it's unclear in this context. They have monogamous hetero as most privileged, and then homosexual / polyamorous as less privileged. So I find that interesting. They don't differentiate between monogamous homosexual and non-monogamous homosexual. Is monogamous homosexual even really a thing for men? I mean, from their own admission, not commonly. But yeah, they have cis men as most privileged, then cis women / passing trans. This is the only one that differentiates between passing trans and non-passing trans. And then they have the least privileged as visibly trans. So I find that interesting. It's like, if they are passing trans, why would they not be just as privileged as cis men? I don't know. But yeah, they have passing trans, because if they're truly passing, then nobody would know they're trans. So then wouldn't they be, at least the trans men would be in the same category as cis men, and then the trans women would be in the same category as cis women if they're passing? I don't know. This is very confusing. So it has passing trans in the median category, and then visibly trans as least privileged. This one for body type is interesting. It's the only one that acknowledges that muscular men are, well, it doesn't even differentiate men, just that having, it just says muscular, could be men or women, but it's the only one that differentiates that being muscular makes you more privileged in some ways. So they have as the most privileged category is slim slash muscular, then less than in between. This one's interesting. The in between category is very slim slash straight size. I do not know what straight size means. Slash small fat slash mid fat. So these are the only people acknowledging skinny fat as a category, and also acknowledging that like anorexic people, like extremely slim, are actually viewed as less attractive than like people who are slim but not ridiculously so. So this is the only one that's like really, really differentiating in terms of body types down to the nitty gritty. Now this is where it gets funny. For the least privileged category of body types, they have mid fat, large fat, super fat, and then infinifat. I am not kidding. They actually, unironically, not as a joke, have a category called infinifat. Like that should be a superhero. Like, I am infinifat. I eat 20 Big Macs a day. I shit out my enemies. I will eat them and shit out their corpses. I am infinifat. Like, oh my gosh, infinifat. Yeah. So infinifat infinifat people are the least privileged. They're in the least privileged category along with super fat. Maybe super fat is the superhero and infinifat is the super villain. I don't know, but yeah, there's infinifat and super fat. Large fat and mid fat are all together as the least privileged category. But shouldn't those be multiple gradients? Like, shouldn't mid fat and small fat be still more privileged? No, wait, sorry. Yeah. Shouldn't large fat and mid fat be more privileged than infinifat? Like super fat would be less privileged, and then infinifat would be the least privileged category. I'm sorry, I just can't get over this infinifat designation. Like, are they actually serious with this? Like, they don't, like, were they actually trying to be serious when they unironically use the word infinifat in their privilege? So yeah, okay. The next category for race, they have white, and then white presenting BIPOC is the in-between category. And when they say white presenting is different than white passing, because white passing means you're not technically white, but you look white enough that people think you're white. Whereas white presenting simply means that, like, culturally you act white, but it doesn't necessarily mean you look white. I don't know, what did they mean, white passing or white presenting, but they use the word white presenting. It's a bit confusing. In the final category, they have visibly black / brown / indigenous / Asian. So this is interesting. They actually put Asians as equally as oppressed as blacks. Like, I would say most woke SJWs in this day and age consider East Asians to be less oppressed than blacks. They would put them in an intermediate category between whites and blacks, especially Northeast Asians. Like, are they honestly going to argue that from their own ideological perspective that Japanese and Korean people are equally as unprivileged and disadvantaged as blacks? Like, most of these wokesters have some concept of gradients there. Like, even the people who are like Asian leftists who are constantly advocating on behalf of Asian issues and perceived discrimination against Asians will still usually acknowledge it's like, yes, but we are more privileged than blacks in Western countries. Like, they will acknowledge that, albeit begrudgingly at times. But yeah, it's interesting that this one has Asians and blacks at the same level, which is definitely controversial and unusual for wokesters. This one, the next category of religion, has Christian over what the fuck, celebrates Christian holidays. So that would be like agnostics and like cultural Christians, I guess. And then everyone else. So I guess celebrates Christian holidays really means people of a Christian background, but who don't really go to church or don't believe in God or whatever, I guess. It's interesting that they have religious Christians as more privileged because I think you can make the argument that like agnostics and like so-called cultural Christians are in some ways more privileged than religious Christians in our society today. But again, this whole thing is just bullshit. So, uh, then for age, it has adult over young adult slash older adult. And then the least privileged is minor slash senior. So yeah, this one does seem to have middle aged as the most privileged category, which is consistent with most of these. As homeowner as more privileged than renter, which again, consistent with most of these. Now, this one's very interesting. This is the only one that has the category for what kind of transportation you use, and it has drivers as most privileged, public transit users in between, and no access to transportation as least privileged. I find this very interesting because they're basically like going along with the car brain idea that having a car makes your life better and that driving makes you more privileged. Or I would personally say you're in some ways you're more privileged if you live in a place that has access to good transit because then you actually have the choice. Whereas if you live in sprawl, it's like driving is basically your only choice. So I would say having access to good public transit is actually unironically a privilege, but this one is very much internalized the car brain idea that like driving is freedom. And I would argue no, I would argue that true freedom is actually being able to choose, and which people living in sprawl don't have the choice. So that this is interesting that they put drivers as the most privileged category. Okay, so final 12th and final privilege wheel. This one has slim as most privileged, then average, then large. So, then it has cis man over cis woman over trans slash non-binary, white over different shades over dark, hetero over gay man over lesbian slash bi slash asexual. So this one's very consistent with most of them. Same kind of rankings. So yeah, those are the 12 privilege wheels that I looked at. So yeah, from this you can find a lot of interesting results. It just goes to show the internal inconsistencies of their ideology and just how much of it is ultimately like very flimsy and very self-contradictory. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the wheel of privilege.